In a recent conversation with The Guardian, Paul McCartney, now 83, stopped dodging old wounds and calmly walked through them. He spoke of women who, in his words, left marks that never quite faded. One whose presence ignited the split of the world's most famous band. One whose marriage to him turned into a public spectacle. One who, he felt, helped pull apart lifelong friendships. And one who exposed him to ridicule as unfaithful on national television. Who were they? And which name left the deepest scar? London, Spring, 1966. At the Indica Gallery, John Lennon encountered Yoko Ono, a petite, fiercely avant-garde Japanese artist staging a boundary-pushing show. One of her pieces, Cut Piece, invited the audience to snip away her clothing while she remained still, a statement as stark as it was provocative. Lennon, tired of his clean-cut image, was electrified. Their letters began almost at once, art, dreams, philosophy, an orbit that soon drew him away from the old rhythms. At first, Paul McCartney shrugged her off as John's eccentric friend. By 1968, that changed. Yoko began sitting inside Abbey Road sessions, something the band had quietly agreed would never happen with partners or outsiders. She brought a chair, sat next to John, and occasionally commented on tempo or harmony. An EMI tech remembered, every time Yoko spoke, Paul's jaw tightened and the room froze. Tension thickened through the White Album. George Harrison walked out mid-session. Ringo Starr later admitted he felt surplus. Paul, meticulous and sensitive to studio flow, found the dynamic unbearable. I can't compose with someone perched beside me like a supervisor. There was even a moment when Yoko suggested adding metal basin percussion to Obla Da. Paul glanced at John. John smiled. George Martin left to smoke. No argument. Just a room that forgot how to breathe. Soon, the boundaries exploded. Lennon and Ono issued Unfinished Music No. 1. Two versions, its nude cover forcing EMI into public apologies. British tabloids raged. The Daily Mirror labeled Yoko the most disliked woman in England. New Musical Express sneered that when the Beatles fell quiet, Yoko's voice got louder. At home, Cynthia Lennon discovered Yoko in her Kenwood house before divorce papers even arrived. Paul later said, I felt for Cynthia, but John was gone already. By late 1969, Paul proposed Get Back to reset the band's spirit. John shot back, I've got Yoko. I don't need the Beatles anymore. Biographer Hunter Davies called it the gunshot that ended a legendary brotherhood. Even Money Matters split along Yoko's shadow. Paul pushed for Lee Eastman, Linda Eastman's father, to steady Apple Corps. John, backed by Yoko, chose Alan Klein, a decision that detonated lawsuits through the 1970s. The feud spilled onto vinyl. On Ram, 1971, Paul slipped in the barb, Too Many People. You took your lucky break and broke it in two. Lennon answered with, How do you sleep? The only thing you'd done was yesterday. And since you've gone, you're just another day. George Harrison played guitar on the track, which stung Paul like a second betrayal. Even after John's murder in 1980, the frost never fully thawed. In 1987, Paul said, I never felt comfortable around Yoko. There was something about her that made me feel controlled. In 1990, at a New York tribute, observers noted he never once looked her way. Decades later, on McCartney, A Life in Lyrics, 2023, he sighed, I lost my best friend. I don't know who to blame, but it all started when she walked into the studio. Whatever the world thought of Yoko Ono, to Paul she embodied loss of a friend, a band, and a certain golden light that never came back. It's quite a weird situation. Suddenly, for the first time in your life, you're living very, very intimately with someone who you don't necessarily know. Summer 1999, Dorchester Hotel, London. After Linda McCartney's death, Paul had retreated to his Sussex farm, certain he'd never love again. Then he met Heather Mills, a model whose 1993 accident had cost part of her leg, and whose confidence and survival story seemed to reopen life's window. Within months, she moved in. On June 11, 2002, they married at Castle Leslie in Ireland. Fireworks, Elton John, Ringo Starr, the works. Paul told the crowd, "I believe Linda is looking down and smiling." The smile didn't last. Post-wedding, Heather began managing his calendar, screening friends, and steering interviews. A team member told The Telegraph she wanted to be manager, spokesperson, and final say. TV appearances multiplied 2003, 2005, each one stirring whispers that the marriage was fracturing. In 2006, Heather filed for divorce, asking for $250 million. The nation followed each hearing from the Royal Courts of Justice. In February 2008, Heather addressed the court for nearly 2 hours, live on Sky News. Paul said only, "I just want this to be over." On March 17, 2008, the judgment landed $24 million, a fraction of what she sought. Justice Sir Hugh Bennett called her less than credible, exaggerated, unreliable. The line traveled faster than any song. Outside, Heather threw water on Paul's lawyer, Fiona Shackleton, on camera. An instant meme. Headlines winked, "Let it be." Paul slipped out a side door and told Reuters, "I'm glad this is finally over." Heather hit the talk shows, Larry King Live, ITV Tonight, insisting the public didn't know the real story. But a 2008 YouGov poll found 74% of Britons believed she wanted money and fame. Commentator Piers Morgan observed, "From legendary Beatle to an old man duped by a model, Paul showed the world his most vulnerable side." For Paul, the worst loss wasn't the money. It was face. He once told Denny Lane, "I lost more than money. I lost face." He never said Heather's name again. Asked about his second marriage, he half smiled. That was an expensive lesson. They share a daughter, Beatrice. Heather runs a vegan brand. Paul kept writing, touring, and rebuilding the calm that had been his hallmark. 1968 was chaos, Yoko in the studio, egos clashing, the center not holding. In the swirl, Paul met Linda Eastman, a photographer for Rolling Stone, at the Bag O' Nails Club. She didn't gush, didn't grab for a photo, she just smiled and worked. Paul later said he felt an immediate difference, quiet, steady, real. They married in March 1969 at Marylebone Town Hall. John, George, Ringo didn't attend. Outside, a BBC reporter called, "Are the Beatles finished?" Paul kissed his wife instead of answering. After the breakup, 1970, Paul's one-man album McCartney drew fire for lacking Beatles spirit. Linda urged him onward. Then came Wings, 1971. Paul put Linda on keyboards and backing vocals. Britain balked. "Genius or madness?" sneered Melody Maker. NME joked she never played a wrong note because she didn't play. Paul doubled down. On the 1972 European tour, crowds booed when she sang. In Gothenburg, fans chanted, "Bring back the Beatles." After one show, Paul smashed a dressing room door. No one laughs at Linda. When Wildlife stumbled, critics blamed her. The Times called it a failed experiment by the man who wrote Let It Be. Paul banned the paper from his home. Then, with tapes stolen and morale battered, he and Linda flew to Lagos to record Band on the Run, 1973. The album roared back with 3 Grammys. Paul said, "Without Linda, I couldn't have done it." The public credited Paul, not Linda. The split in perception hardened. By 1976, at Madison Square Garden, when Linda missed a cue in Live and Let Die, the jeers returned. Paul stepped up. "Anyone came here to put her down? Try it." Silence. Later, he admitted, "With the Beatles, I was part of a myth. With Wings, I was a bloke defending his wife." In 1995, Linda was diagnosed with breast cancer. Paul dropped everything, Mayo Clinic to Royal Marsden, long country drives, small smiles. On April 17, 1998, at their Tucson ranch, she died. Paul sat beside her, holding her hand, quietly playing Let Me Roll It. Tributes poured in, some beautiful, some cruel. Now Paul can make real music again. Those lines hurt more than any review. In a brief appearance after the funeral, he said, "Linda always believed I was greater than the Beatles. I only realized too late how much that faith cost her." Watching Wingspan, 2001, he cried seeing old footage of her being booed. "I once blamed her for ruining my reputation," he said. "Now I blame myself for not saying sorry sooner." To fans, Linda either saved Paul or sank him. To Paul, She was the love that rescued and scarred him, proof that the bravest devotion sometimes carries the harshest public price. 1963, peak Beatlemania. Paul met Jane Asher, red-haired, 17, clever, and poised, at a BBC interview. She opened London's doors, Wimpole Street, poetry, theater. In the attic room of her family's house, he wrote, "Yesterday, and I love her. We can work it out." Britain fell for them as a pair. At Christmas 1967, he gave her a ruby ring. The nation expected a fairy tale wedding. But in 1968, after a run in Bristol, Jane returned to Cavendish Avenue early and found Paul with Francie Schwartz, a 23-year-old American writer newly tied to Apple Corp. Jane quietly set down her keys and left. The next day on BBC's D Time, Jane said, "I am no longer engaged to Paul McCartney." One sentence, and years of good boy image collapsed. Daily Mirror blazed. Jane Asher leaves Beatle fiancé after catching him with another. Paul vanished for months, then appeared with Francie at Savile Row. Letters poured in. "You've killed England's sweetest dream," music remembered. Jane more tenderly than headlines, "For No One," 1966. Cuts to the bone, your day breaks, your mind aches. We Can Work It Out plays like a musical apology. Decades later, Paul admitted she needed say nothing else. One sentence and the country turned its back. In the 1960s, Cynthia lived the part millions wanted, Mrs. Lennon, and found it lonelier than anyone imagined. She remembered noodles and 2 shirts before the world turned. In that world, Paul alone brought Christmas gifts, played with Julian, and, when everything collapsed, wrote "Hey Jude" for John's son. But the tenderness soured in print. In 1978, Cynthia published A Twist of Lennon. She painted Paul as controlling over music, cold during the family split. He came after John left, offered a few kind words, and disappeared. Music mattered more than people. When The Guardian quoted it, scandal bloomed. In 1979, Paul fired back to Rolling Stone. "She's just trying to sell books." Readers bristled. Paul looked heartless. Cynthia's later 2005 book, John claimed Paul once told John at Apple Corp, "Stop with Yoko, she'll destroy everything," she wrote. He was right, but John would never forgive him. Fans split again. Paul mostly refused to engage. "I dislike how the Lennon name is used to tell unrelated stories." When Cynthia Lennon died in 2015 in Mallorca, Paul tweeted, "She was a good person. I will always remember." No speech, no stage. Just the ache of a past that never really closes. 1964, A Hard Day's Night. George Harrison noticed Pattie Boyd, all sunshine and swinging London. They married in 1966 at Epsom Register Office. Paul stood nearby, proud as best friend and best man. But London whispered. Eric Clapton fell in love with Pattie, poured his obsession into Layla, 1970, told George straight out. George kept pouring tea. Rumors nipped at Paul, too, that he'd had a quiet crush on Pattie during Help, 65. NME writers fanned it. Daily Mirror twisted denials into headlines. Paul fumed. "I don't write songs for someone else's wife." It didn't matter. By the 1970s, Pattie became shorthand for the love tangle era that gnawed Beatle friendships thin. When Pattie and George divorced in 1977, and she married Clapton 2 years later, Britain buzzed anew. Paul stayed away. No congratulations, no comment. Each time Pattie released a memoir, Wonderful Tonight, 2007, My Life in Pictures, 2022, editors dragged Paul's name into the margins. On air in 2018, asked if the Beatles were jealous of each other's partners, he smiled. "No, but we weren't innocent either." One line, 100 headlines. Pattie lives quietly in Surrey now. Paul is still on stage, but you can see him measure the room sometimes, wary of a single glance turning into a week of rumors. Summer 1968. Francie Schwartz, 23, newly arrived at Apple Corp, clever and bold, walked into Savile Row and left with Paul's attention. Jane was on tour. The band was unraveling. Francie moved into Cavendish Avenue. One July morning, Jane Asher came home early, found them together, left without a word, and said on BBC's D Time, 3 days later, "Paul and I are no longer engaged." The country reeled. Daily Mirror. Jane Asher catches Paul McCartney with American Girl. Years later, Francie's 1972 memoir, Body Count, fueled a second fire. Too detailed, too intimate. Paul told friends it felt like a double betrayal, once in love, once in print. He spent years rebuilding what one afternoon had smashed. One Beverly Hills hotel gala, one perfectly timed laugh, one hand on a shoulder. Then, Los Angeles Times shouted, Beatle Paul finds new love in Hollywood. Peggy Lipton, a fresh star of The Mod Squad, and Paul chatted for minutes. Music, California, current work. A photographer's flash did the rest. New York Post invented dinners, Daily Mirror imagined beach walks. Paul, still committed to Jane, squirmed as Johnny Carson asked, "Are you dating Peggy Lipton?" "We're just friends," Paul said. Far too late. Silence, as Brian Epstein warned him, is confession in Hollywood. The Beatle Playboy tag clung for years, bruising sponsorships and interviews. Only after marrying Linda in 1969 did it fade. January 1964, Olympia, Paris. Françoise Hardy, Paris's melancholy muse, watched front row. Paul was flattered, stunned that she'd come. Backstage, they exchanged a few polite words. One photograph captured them smiling. The next morning, French papers teased, Beatle Paul charms France's muse. Soon Le Figaro imagined lyrics born from an unfulfilled English love. Paul protested to NME, "I only met her once. No dates, nothing at all. It didn't help." Hardy never fanned it, never snuffed it out either. In 1969, asked about Paul, she said, "Il est charmant." That was enough to reboot a dozen columns. Years later, in Le Désespoir des Singes, 2008, she wrote a single low-key line about a polite backstage chat. By then, the damage was done. Proof to Paul that one photograph can steer a life for a very long time. So, who hurt Paul McCartney most? Only he knows. Yoko Ono stands for the friend he lost, and the band that slipped away. Heather Mills made him the butt of jokes, rather than the author of them. Linda McCartney saved his life, and, fairly or not, was blamed for ruining a legend's mystique. Jane Asher turned one sentence into a national verdict. Cynthia Lennon pulled him into grief that wasn't his to carry. Pattie Boyd became a symbol of fractures between brothers. Francie Schwartz broke an engagement and set off a lifetime of second-guessing. Peggy Lipton proved Hollywood can invent a lover out of a laugh. Françoise Hardy showed how a rumor can age better than the truth. Behind the timeless melodies are scars that never fully closed, proof that even a life set to perfect choruses can be punctured by whispers, headlines, and hearts that don't behave. Maybe that's why the songs still reach people decades later. They weren't written by a saint, but by a man who's bled in public and learned to keep singing anyway.